here. Thank you for joining us. We'll do some intros here, but we're going to talk about how to replace Google Analytics with RudderStack, a very provocative subject, and that I'm really excited to dive into because I've used both tools extensively, even before I joined RudderStack. So here's what we're going to cover today. So we're going to talk about limitations of Google Analytics, which some of those may seem obvious, but some of them may not. And then we'll also talk about what Google Analytics is good for, because it is really helpful for some particular things in the stack. We're going to talk about how to migrate to RudderStack to replace GA. So Alex has done this multiple times, so he'll talk us through that. And then really I think the most exciting part is unlocking the ability to track the full customer journey with the data you get through RudderStack. And then we'll wrap it up by talking about tracking ad campaigns and conversions. So you can get some really, really detailed reporting on, cost per acquisition, by campaign, even down to sort of the ad level if you want, which is cool. So quick introductions. I will give Alex a monumental introduction. Alex and I met, gosh, almost a year ago now.
Jeez.
Before I joined RudderStack. And you were at Mattermost, and you had joined Mattermost. You'd been there, I guess, a couple months after coming from Heroku, and did the whole RudderStack implementation at Mattermost. And now you run a consultancy called Big Time Data, where you help people build out their data stacks. Any important points that I missed about?
No, I think that's it. I would say that, our main thing at Big Time Data is just that what we came to realize is like everybody really has all the same problems with data, understanding it, getting the value out of it. And so me and my co-founder met at Heroku. We moved to Mattermost, built all that out at both those places. And then at Big Time Data, we're just kind of taking that show on the road, and we just want to help everybody make sense of their data and really unlock the value of it.
Awesome. And I am Eric, Director of Customer Success at RudderStack. And let's dive into it. So Google Analytics, limitations and use cases. This is probably a really familiar view to anyone who has used Google Analytics. And it's kind of funny, I just pulled an image from Google image search. And of course, Neil Patel is like the top, image search result, which makes sense. He's like the SEO optimization master. Okay, I'm going to start and do the first couple of bullet points here, and then let you take it over, Alex. So, first of all, Google Analytics is not really good for user-level views of data. Now we'll talk about GA4 in a minute, but you're mainly looking at aggregate data. Of course, you can sort of drill down into the data a little bit and look at events, but in terms of tracking an individual's customer journey or getting deep sort of attribute level information, Google Analytics just doesn't really do that. And the limited functionality it has isn't that helpful, at least for moderately complex use cases. And raw data, actually, Alex, you want to talk about this? Because I think you felt the pain of this.
Yeah, we've had some times with Google Analytics, but the thing that always happens with Google Analytics is it provides you that initial oh, wow, this is so cool. It gives me sessions and page views and users and stuff. But then it's when you want to get that level deeper and start really unlocking the whole power, and we're going to go into this later, but, to map all this to your full customer journey, especially once they get into your product and stuff, not only can you not get the raw data that would give you the ability to see exactly what that user journey was, but if you did, it's crazy expensive. And yeah, it's just been a nightmare to deal with.
Sure. Inflexible event structure. This is really simple. So you have sort of action and label for events in Google Analytics and Classic, and you sort of have to align all of your event tracking to that. A lot of people track events that they're sending to other properties, sort of like Facebook or Google conversions separately than you're doing Google. And so you have multiple sort of events happening. It just becomes really messy. And they sort of force you to align to their structure in Google Analytics Classic. And then full funnel reporting is complicated cross-property, and cross-property applies both to Google Analytics properties, but also technical properties. So for example, we have RudderStack.com, which is our marketing site, and we have app.rudderstack.com, which is our actual app that users log into. And so having all of that data in one Google Analytics property gets really noisy, but if you separate them, you're looking at different reports for different parts of the funnel. And so it just creates challenges, and it's pretty hard to keep clean. Dashboarding and custom reports, they aren't that great on GA Classic. We'll talk about how it's a little bit better in GA4. And then Alex, talk about when people upgrade sites or create additional GA properties, et cetera. That gets real messy real fast.
Yeah, and so for an example of this at Mattermost, we had, www, the marketing site, mattermost.com. Then we had like docs, you got support, you've got the product. We've got like a sort of a cloud interface just for buying the on-prem license. That's all different, right? And so it's like, if you have to split all this stuff up into, all this stuff that you're looking at, like, you're not going to be able to really get a true grasp of what's going on across these things, and really like tracking them across, like, in your marketing site, you're going to have things that link to your docs and vice versa and all that kind of stuff. So it's like, what's really going on here? Google Analytics isn't going to tell you. So that's where RudderStack's going to come in and make it a lot easier for you.
Yeah, I think one practical way that this problem shows up is you just keep dumping more and more ops time into really becoming an advanced Google Analytics implementation expert. And there's it's sort of a never-ending challenge, and there's a point at which there's diminishing returns. Let's talk about what Google Analytics is good at. It is great for aggregate views that individual users who want self-serve analysis can leverage, right? So content performance, social media teams, content teams. Let's look at, time on page, number of blog posts viewed per session, incoming traffic and time on site from particular social channels. That's where out-of-the-box sessionization and other components like that are really, it's just really helpful and frankly, just really easy. You put the script on the site. If it's pretty clean and you're looking at one particular property, it's a great self-serve analytics tool for those purposes. And then the other point I would make is that for aggregate e-commerce analytics, it's actually pretty good because they include a lot of the e-commerce spec out of the box, and they have the basic funnel built in. You can get really advanced, and there are better ways to do more complex e-commerce reporting. But for a lot of basic e-commerce use cases, it's pretty dang good for your basic funnel optimization and understanding where follow-ups are happening. Again, the user level stuff, you can't really get that deep, which is where you can actually sort of uncover things like lifetime value. But for the aggregate view, it's pretty good for e-commerce. What else? Anything else that comes to mind, Alex, that I didn't mention?
I was just going to say, we had another webinar about the data stack journey and the blog post that I wrote about it too. And this is where, like, most tools have some value. And obviously Google Analytics does have value, just like you said, in this specific case. And it honestly even has some value, again, if you're just looking for aggregate views of this stuff. It's really, once you're sort of past that point on your data stack journey, to where it's like, okay, cool, we have some aggregate views of stuff. Things are starting to get too complicated for Google Analytics to come, to make sense of it anymore. What now? And I think what we're trying to get across here is once you hit that inflection point, that's hey, we need RudderStack. Let's use RudderStack to solve this problem.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a point at which you're asking Google Analytics to do things that it really wasn't designed to do.
Yeah, and then once you start getting into that, like you said, once you start getting into that, it turns into a, you have to be some crazy ops guy and you're just pouring time into it. That's really not meant, or not really getting you the value that you should be getting.
Yep. Okay, so one of the questions that we discuss a lot when it comes to Google Analytics is, but what about GA4? So here's the hot take on GA4. It's a huge improvement on flexibility as far as events go. So it tracks events actually more similar to the paradigm of sort of a RudderStack-esque approach, where you have an event and then you have attributes or properties related to that event. Way better there. And you can get a way more detailed look at sort of specific user behaviors, which is good. And then the custom reporting and dashboarding is way better. You can get way more detailed. It's just way more flexible from that standpoint. So I think what will happen with GA4 is it will take earlier companies further in their ability to sort of leverage the tool to get insight. But there are still major challenges, especially for companies that scale or want more granular data. So you still can't get the raw data. And then this, I think, is one of the big things with Google Analytics in general for most companies is the data is actually still trapped in Google Analytics and it can't be activated to support other business functions. So it's really just sort of a dead end, if you will, for analysis, which is fine. But once you have that analysis, if you don't have the raw data and the ability to sort of activate that, there's a huge amount of manual labor that goes into that. And then, of course, it's actually still really hard to do the full funnel reporting cross-property, which is sort of a fundamental challenge. Okay. How do we migrate to RudderStack to replace GA? I thought first, what would be good is to talk about the why. And I'll start by saying, it's really not either or, RudderStack or Google Analytics. Most companies run both of them. They just use Google Analytics for what it's really good at, which is sort of the aggregate self-serve side of things. And they use RudderStack's event stream. But Alex, walk us through some of the other reasons. Why would you sort of migrate from using Google Analytics as your main detailed analytics tool to RudderStack event stream?
I think it's really, once you get to that place, especially for, B2B kind of SaaS companies, especially, you have a marketing site where you're trying to convert people to sign up for your product. And then what you want to know after that is, well, what are they doing in my product? And, or are they being successful with my product? And then you can do so many different things. I think fundamentally, it almost comes to the idea of RudderStack's warehouse first approach, right? Which is something we've always been a fan of and try to preach the gospel of. It's like, if we can get all this raw data into our warehouse, then that really unlocks the full power of it, as opposed to, oh, I've got all this data over in Google Analytics and I've got other data over here and I don't know how to mesh it together to give me anything. So by having it in the warehouse, that's where you can use like the DBT models, which we'll go into. You can put BI tools on top of it. And then with, RudderStack's warehouse actions, then it's like, okay, well, I have this data, I've transformed it, I've analyzed it. Now I want to go push it out to other tools like Salesforce or other CRM data, Mixpanel. The possibilities become a lot more endless than, oh, I can just look at my marketing site's performance for Google Analytics right here. The other thing I would say too, that is important, is that ability to have the more of that context on the events that you are sending to RudderStack, because then all of a sudden you can have product identifiers and what user is this in my product database and things like that, where you can really start mapping together all the things, and it just makes it unlocks the power.
Yeah, the payloads can be much richer. I think that's a great point, right? Whereas with Google Analytics, again, this is a little bit better in GA4, but with a RudderStack payload coming from your website, you can add any sort of dynamic properties, right? We often say, if it's in the DOM, you can pass it through as a property. And so you can get as much rich diagnostic information about any behavior as you want, and then use all of that downstream in interesting ways. I think one other point that, and I remember sort of going through, this is, gosh, 5 or 6 years ago, but going through the this exact process of, wow, you don't have to be beholden to just sort of one analytics tool that you can't get data out of. And I think one of the big things for me was realizing, oh, wow, like I can track an event once and send it to Google Analytics, but then also send it to Amplitude for product. I can also send it to, you know, the Kafka stream that feeds whatever data science flows are, you know, they're working on. I can send it to, you know, et cetera, which is really cool. And that was really sort of paradigm shifting, where it's really, like we said before, not Google Analytics or RudderStack, but you can actually do both. And you can use RudderStack to feed Google Analytics, but then it can also feed any other tool in your stack, including the warehouse. And so you can use point solutions for analytics for different teams, right? So, oh, product uses Mixpanel, just route the feed to Mixpanel, right? And then, of course, you can see down here on the slide, we have a Snowflake table, and then you can go into a tool like Looker, or, you know, if you're, a lot of companies are using Data Studio, which is getting better and better. You know, sort of for earlier stage, Data Studio is pretty powerful, but then you can have the raw data and you're not beholden to the prepackaged reports. You can do whatever you want with it to meet the needs of your business.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, let's get technical.
Let's do it. So I think the thing that people probably are thinking to themselves, like, wow, guys, that sounds so amazing. I'd love to do that, but how do I do it, right? So I think it is pretty straightforward. Obviously, I come from like the engineering background, so to me, this is all like pretty basic. But I mean, it's as simple as basically how you're loading Google Analytics itself, right? It's a similar kind of thing. Include some JavaScript in your page, and that'll, I mean, just out of the box, that'll automatically start sending those page events, which will give you, honestly, it gives you a lot of value, just even that one thing. Like, I mean, it's literally like, I don't know, 3 lines of code or something that you have to put in. I think the thing that starts to really take Rudder Analytics over the top is when you start adding more of those properties and context to those events. So you can add those track calls to, like you have this example, the form submit, or when they click a button, or whatever the conversion target might be. You can see there, you're getting all sorts of stuff into that, which again, that feeds your downstream warehouse, and then you can do whatever you want to that. The other thing I will say is, for the sort of SaaS model, it's like when that user does sign up, and like, or if they identify themselves really in any way, like if you capture their email or whatever, that's what you're going for, call that identify call, and then we'll get into some of the DBT modeling that you can do, but you can then start attributing, like, not only the first time that user visited your site when they were anonymous, but now you can tie that together to everything they've done after they identified themselves. So you really have this like full picture of like, well, how long did it take this person to convert? And, you know, how much are they using the product afterwards? So it's really, really powerful. And I think the other thing about it is, not only can you use RudderStack on all your different properties, right? So then you're tracking essentially the same person across all those properties, whether it's like your doc site, your support, you know, if you're running Zendesk or whatever. But then also, like, once they get into your product, and even like the thing that I think ends up becoming even more interesting is when you then have events that are sent from your backend servers, which this is sort of over the top for this, but I think that can also unlock a lot of power as well, is track even more events. RudderStack's the kind of thing where it's like, once you kind of like get it in there, you're like, oh, we should use it on this thing. And then we should use it on this thing. We should use it for that thing. And so it sort of just kind of spreads around everywhere. And honestly, that's for the best, because the more data that you get into your warehouse, then you can really unlock the power of it.
Sure. Yeah, and I think one thing that I think may be helpful is I'll just quickly walk through this payload here. This is a tracked call for a form submit. So a track call would be the equivalent of what Google Analytics would treat as an event. So you can see that this is tracking a form submit, and we're packing a bunch of information in here. So the page that it's on, so we're calling document title to grab the page URL. And some of these are included in the payload by default. It's just easier to have them in the properties object. We're grabbing the form ID. So on this particular website, there's form IDs that sort of identify, is it a blog subscription, is it a demo request, etc. And then one other interesting thing is that you can see there's a property there called label. And by default, RudderStack will send that to Google Analytics as the label. So we're using the form ID as the label. And so this is where you can see earlier when we talked about it's not an either or. We actually use this payload to feed Google Analytics and populate an event in Google Analytics. And the label is the form ID, which is pretty cool. And then, there are various other properties there. And then we'll talk about campaign tracking. You can see that we're actually pulling the UTM parameters into the form submit payload as properties. This is really, really useful. In a lot of cases, people will do things that are hard to scale, like create hidden fields and pass UTM parameters into hidden fields so that they're written to the contact record. But then if you have the users, if there's multiple actions, they get overwritten. So then you have to do logic and it becomes really crazy. Whereas one thing that's just so convenient, especially when you think about a user level or sort of the events in GA not being tied to a specific user, is you have each distinct form submit that someone's performed with the UTM parameters so that you have the attribution for each of those distinct actions. So when you think about building multi-touch attribution models, et cetera, it becomes way easier when you get the raw data, and then you can package all of the information you need in each payload, which is really cool.
Yeah, and one last thing I'll say about the default parameters that end up getting sent on a lot of these. You also get all the browser version and browser type and all that kind of stuff. So then you can have all those graphs that are like, oh, we have 40% of people are using Chrome and they're using this version, and these people are using their mobile phones and all that kind of stuff. So it sort of gives you literally you have the raw data of everything that Google Analytics has. It's just now you actually have access to that raw data. And obviously it's not costing you a gazillion dollars.
Every single page view and every single
right.
behavioral, which is actually really interesting. You can think about in Google Analytics, you do that by sort of creating lots of drill downs. But if you think about the context of having all of that in a set of warehouse tables, simple pivots can give you much more dynamic reporting, which is really cool.
Yeah. Okay, so basically, like we said, with the basic RudderStack setup, you really have all the data that Google Analytics is capturing. So you're capturing the same exact stuff. And this is where I want to get into sort of the warehouse first approach and using DBT, which stands for Data Build Tool, which is a tool that we're always espousing in tandem with RudderStack. These are kind of like the things that we always come to our clients with. You guys should be using DBT and RudderStack. RudderStack themselves have created a couple packages related to all this stuff to make it really easy to build the data models with DBT. And, these are vetted, created by RudderStack. So you can get you take this raw data that's coming from RudderStack, and then all of a sudden on the other end, you run DBT through these packages on it, and you have this actionable, valuable data. So you have the customer journeys, the sessionization, and the identity resolution one actually is a pretty big one as well. And so by why is it such a hard word to say? Sessionization. It's just a hard word, I guess. So sessionization is basically trying to tag a set of events that a user has completed into one session. So then you can start doing session analytics that say well, how many average page views do we have per session? How long does an average session last? And then you can even get into some of that funnel stuff that you're showing that Google Analytics does as well, where it's this session ended with a cart sign up or whatever checkout thing. And then the identity resolution one, I think, is the real key, because this is the one that allows you to tie together all the events, even when they were anonymous, to when they signed up for your product and you actually haven't, or if they submitted a form, but when they identify themselves, now you can go back and look in the past at what were all the things that this user did before they converted, which can be super valuable. And then did you want to talk about the attribution one?
Yes, actually, let's talk about that. I think I have that towards the end of the presentation.
All right, cool.
But I do want to ask, so how much work is this? Because I'll play devil's advocate a little bit here because my background, I come from marketing. And so my kind of gut response would be, yeah, it sounds awesome to have all the information you're talking about, but man, that sounds like a ton of work to like get DBT up and running. Is this something I'm going to have to repeatedly look at, you know, for sessionization? You know, how much work is it to sort of get this basic, get this foundational set? Really what we're talking about is this foundational set of derived tables in the warehouse done so that you can actually start to have an analyst do some of the reporting pieces of it.
Yeah. So I wish Rachel was here. She would be able to totally kill this because she's a little less technical. But I think, you know, the thing with DBT has their own cloud SaaS product. So you can just sign up for that. It's really easy. Connect it to your warehouse. That should hopefully be relatively easy. And then downloading these packages that you guys have already created is also, you know, I mean, you read some docs, it's fairly easy. And then, you know, you can just leverage DBT. So, I mean, my opinion, it's not that bad. And I think the beauty of DBT has been that they've really designed it for more of the analytics type person instead of the hardcore engineer type person. So it's not like you need to go hire some crazy expensive engineer to like do all this stuff. You can have an analyst and really anybody who has even like a relatively basic knowledge of SQL will be able to accomplish this stuff.
So you're talking about a couple of days of work after you get the data piping into the warehouse. You're talking about a couple of days of work to get the set of the sort of derived tables that allow you to build all this amazing reporting.
Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, you know, connecting that stuff to your BI tool, whether or not you're using Data Studio or Looker. Obviously, I feel like if you're using Looker, you probably have somebody who, you know, knows Looker. So like they'll be able to hook that up easy peasy. But even with Data Studio, it's like, if you just point at, you know, point your BI tool at like some of these tables that the RudderStack packages have built for you, like it's going to be relatively straightforward to build, you know, visualizations and things. And then, you know, the nice thing is, again, like RudderStack will grow with you, right? So it's like, once I add more like product data and I want to get even more advanced with how I'm capturing these events and like the metadata that I'm sending with them, you can build upon what you have instead of with Google Analytics. It's like, well, this is cool, but I'm stuck. Like I can't really go any further anymore.
Yep, I agree. I would say a best practice that we talk about a lot with our customers is trying to build all of this just so you can look at maybe aggregate metrics that you're already looking at in Google Analytics might not be worth the effort because you can already look at a lot of those things, right? I think the real value comes when you start to look at things like the customer journey and identity resolution pieces.
Yes, the customer journey.
Customer journey.
Yeah, so this is where, this to me is like the real power of RudderStack. And I've kind of like talked about it already before, but it's really like, you know, once they get into your product, you've identified them as a user, and now you can see all of the metrics about what happened before and what happened after, because then you can start doing all sorts of, I mean, you know, once you get to like, you can start taking this in crazy directions where it's like, oh, well, they looked at, you know, this docs page and this marketing page, and when they converted, then they use the product in some specific way. Like you can do sort of cohort analysis, and then you can kind of figure out like, oh, these are the people that are coming into my product. I should really target my marketing more at them, or I need to spend more on them. You know, and also giving you, which I guess we'll get into as well, is like the ad campaign attribution and, you know, am I spending my marketing dollars in the right place? Do I have the right content that's converting? And I think the other thing is you can start saying like, am I getting the right users that I want to have? So yeah, the other thing I would say is, especially once you, if they sign up for, you have like a cloud product or something, if they sign up for your cloud product and you create them like a user record in your database, send that internal ID to in your identify call, because it just makes everybody's life a whole lot easier on the back end, because that's where you can really start tying together all the events from, like your internal product data to your product event data to your marketing web page data. And so you have like this whole thing across everything that like now it ties together. And then once you use RudderStack to send the data to Salesforce or some CRM, HubSpot, whatever, like you have all these identifiers that map up, so you can tell like, when I'm talking about this user in HubSpot, I'm talking about this user in the product, I'm talking about this visitor on the web page.
Yep. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I think when you think about, sort of transactional data from your app database, event data from product usage, and then of course, sort of the top of the funnel marketing journey through the website, being able to have all of that information in a warehouse and then sort of reconstructing for your most valuable customers, what was the journey that actually led them there, and understanding those pathways is super powerful, right? So one example of that is discovering things like, well, the marketing team was really excited because these paid search campaigns had a really efficient cost per lead. But when you tie that together with transactional data over sort of lifetime of usage in the product, then you can see, well, those users over-index for churning after 3 to 4 months, right? And so in reality, the money that we're spending there, we're losing money, right? Because even though it was sort of initially is efficient, they're churning at a much higher rate. And it's impossible to do that with Google Analytics. But once you unlock some of those insights, it can be really, really powerful. Okay.
Ooh, fancy.
Yes, this is an actual report from Looker. I just pulled up a random, because we use our own DBT model for this ourselves, which is kind of cool. And so there's just a bunch of different stuff on there. But why don't you talk about this? Because you built way more of this reporting than I have.
Yeah, so what we do at RudderStack, the events that we're getting from the web pages, and even when we're trying to track like conversions in the product pages, you have all the UTM parameters, you have the Google Ads campaign IDs, and so we basically have written a bunch of reports. We also leverage Looker and DBT. We should really open source some of that stuff, more of that stuff. But anyway, that's where you can really start looking at leveraging the Google Ads like metadata about the campaigns. And then you can join that together with like, well, how are the campaigns actually performing? Which gets you some, in the basic form charts like this, but then, you can really do even more with it. And then the other thing, on the back end, it's like, okay, what if my marketing team, they're like, we have to use Google Analytics, we have to do all this stuff because I want it. It's like, all right, fine. That's where you can like sort of coexist with Google Analytics as well. And so you can use RudderStack warehouse actions to just, okay, we'll send you maybe it's a conversion event or whatever it happens to be that they're looking for, to send that data back to Google Analytics. And that's actually that's sort of happening at Mattermost as we speak, is what we're dealing with right now. So it's just nice to be able to have that functionality already there to like assuage the new, some new marketing person comes in, is like, no, we're a Google Analytics shop and that's what we're going to do. It's like, okay, fine, but we're going to still use RudderStack. Yeah, no, I think that is having the flexibility from sort of the data engineering standpoint. In some ways, people can, like, data engineering can have their cake and eat it too from that standpoint, right? Where
the downstream team wants to use this, and we can coexist peacefully for that, right? Because we can sort of get data in and then get data back out, which is really interesting. The other thing is, from a traditional ETL standpoint, which I know we're talking about event streaming, Google and Google Analytics, but you can use ETL like RudderStack Cloud Extract to pull Google Ads campaign performance data, and Facebook ads, et cetera, campaign performance data from a variety of different ad platforms, Pinterest, et cetera, into the warehouse as well. Then you have your spend data, and because you have all these UTMs, you can start to do really interesting like cost per acquisition analysis by campaign, which is really, really cool. And several of our customers have just really neat setups in terms of sort of, and actually I would say the real utility here is breaking out of the need to rely on what are almost always over-reported conversion numbers in Google and Facebook, right? Which that's a whole other subject we can talk about. But when you have the raw data and the spend numbers and you align that in your warehouse, you know exactly how many people came from this campaign. And you can really get your true cost per acquisition, and sort of triangulating that against the platforms just gives you much, much better insight into actual real performance, as opposed to like, oh, this seems high or this seems low, and are my conversions getting to Google Ads, et cetera. Like you already know, and you can sort of track your own conversions by triangulating the data in your warehouse, as opposed to relying on the Google Ad script sending that. You still want to do that to feed their algorithm, but if you want to know true cost per acquisition, doing that in the warehouse with all the data is really, really cool.
Yeah, and that actually just made me think about like how RudderStack sort of starts to change how you almost think about all of this stuff. Because where you used to have to like, oh well, we need Google Analytics for this, and we need Mixpanel for that, and we need just like all these tools. You just have hundreds of tools, right? Oh, I forgot my login to this one, and I do this one, and all this stuff. It's like with RudderStack, having so much of this functionality sort of just like in this one platform, it makes it a lot easier like to choose like, well, we'll just use RudderStack for this. I need my Google campaign ad data into my warehouse, use RudderStack for that. I need stuff synced out to Google Analytics, use RudderStack for that. Like it just makes your life a whole lot easier just from like an operational perspective. And also, again, having the warehouse first approach really allows you to unlock all the value of your data because it is your data. I think that, that's the biggest thing between sort of the segment and the RudderStack is like, RudderStack's philosophy is it's your data. We're not trying to like lock it behind anything. We want you to get the value out of your data.
Yeah, before I joined RudderStack, I think we've talked about this, but I was running a consultancy that was sort of the more marketing-ish version of big time data, but really focusing on the warehouse and data. And I remember actually finding RudderStack from way long ago, their initial Hacker News post. And I was like, yes, like this is makes everything I'm trying to do for my clients, it makes it 1,000 times easier, Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we still have time, plenty of time for questions, and we may be able to give people some time back depending on how many questions there are. So feel free to type a question into the Q&A box, or if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can ask a question. We're happy to answer any questions. I mean, we've both used Google Analytics pretty extensively and RudderStack pretty extensively. So, all right, Dan, I'm going to allow you to talk here, Dan.
Hey, Eric.
Hey, Dan.
How's it going?
Yeah, not so bad. Great presentation, both of you. Superb. This is kind of exactly along the lines that we're going at Pachyderm using RudderStack. Totally loving the experience, and it really does everything that we kind of wanted it to. I've got a little question for you, Alex, in terms of how you go about, like we're talking about how you're like reinventing the wheel and doing what Google Analytics is already doing, and the time that it takes to do that side of stuff. I know that we've had particular like struggles with doing like referrer categorization to kind of match what you're getting in GA. Have you got any tips as to how to go about doing that in an easy sense, so we get that kind of paid search, organic search type distinction?
Yeah, that is that was actually going to be one of the ones I was like, that's one thing Google Analytics is good at, is the refer stuff.
Yeah, they obviously have a huge data set that they can just like go on.
I know, and see, that's the thing that I think, like, in some ways Google Analytics is kind of cheating, because you wonder how much other information they have about that person skulking around that they can use to leverage. I think with the data that we've been able to do and leverage, I think the refer stuff is, I don't want to say good enough, but good enough. Like, that's where we've sort of landed on it.
Do you kind of aggregate that across all of your clients, so you're able to like build a bigger data set out of what you've got going on there? And if so, is this something that like we could look as a community to like open source to be able to provide that as an additional tool to RudderStack users looking to kind of categorize URLs?
That's a really interesting idea.
That is a really cool idea.
Yeah, because you could like have it stored in some shared, I don't know, Snowflake data set or BigQuery maybe,
or wherever. That's something I've been thinking about for a while, and I think that would really help us. And obviously, we've got a huge amount of data that we're processing and can definitely contribute towards that side of stuff. And with the kind of data science experience that we've got as a company, we could really like feed into that quite well. So something worth maybe chatting about offline. The other thing I was going to mention is the point that you made, Eric, about the PPC data and validating like real world data against Google Analytics. And this is such a huge thing, like you blindly believe what Google Ad Platform is telling you and what Google Analytics are telling you, and what you find in the real world, or certainly what we found, is that data's massively different. That it's hugely inflated on Google's side, and RudderStack has really allowed us to like get some transparency in that data, and even feedback to Google and say, look, this isn't real. What you're giving us here isn't real, and request refunds from ad costing. So
cool.
it's solved loads of problems on that front, and money. So thank you guys.
Awesome.
It's amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Dan. I'm going to mute you and then jump into a couple more questions here.
Yep.
Lots of questions coming in, which is great. Disable talking. Sorry, Dan. Okay, question from George. How can RudderStack help in managing accounts and companies instead of solely users? Great question, and I'm really excited to tell you that the answer is pretty simple. There's a group method that you can run. So identify is what Alex mentioned in order to identify a user. If you want to associate that user with an account, let's just use a simple example of maybe a form fill, and there's a company field on the form fill. You could also run a group call where the company name is the group, and then you can associate that user with the company. So, and we will actually, I think Brooks is on this. We'll send these answers, if there's any sort of relevant links to documentation, et cetera, we'll send that in a follow-up email. So we'll send documentation on the group method as well, but it works great. So if you're thinking about sort of, like Salesforce account, contact, et cetera, it works really well. Fabian or Fabian, is there a way to avoid ad blockers when using RudderStack? We just set it up for product analytics. Cool. Excited to have you on board. Would like to get data on all our users. Yes, we'll include this in the follow-up email as well. But in the, most of our customers actually proxy the JavaScript SDK and deliver it via their CDN. So it's a, essentially a first-party API call, and it's extremely resilient to ad blockers. And we have very deep documentation on how to do that.
Yep, it's pretty easy to set up. I did it for Mattermost. not bad at all. Yeah, and I would honestly suggest doing that if you are going to do RudderStack. Obviously, you can always change it later, but I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, we recommend that as a best practice. Okay, Mike asked, does RudderStack do website visitor identification, or do you need GA or some other tool for that to pull the data in through RudderStack? We do. So every page view that comes in, we assign a unique anonymous ID to that user. And we associate all of their page view events and then any other behavioral events you track to that anonymous ID. And then when you identify them, say they sign up for the product or do a form fill, you identify them, and let's say they sign up for the product and you have an internal ID from your app. That becomes their user ID. We associate the anonymous ID with that user ID, and then in your warehouse, you can key on the anonymous ID to get a full picture of their events, both pre and post identification. It's pretty awesome, actually. It makes tying anonymous events to what becomes a known user way, way easier. Great question. And we can send some docs on that as well, anonymous ID and identification. George had another question. Would syncing user data across different apps in a company be planned use for RudderStack?
Yeah.
I would say so. George, I'm going to allow you to talk, pardon me, to clarify that a little bit more, because you can do some of that already.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, well, the problem that we're seeing currently is that we have different apps across the company. We have a CRM, we have a customer success manager product. We have a chat intercom communications package, and we have data that is produced by all these systems, and we have a lot of problems actually just making sense of it all and syncing it all. Okay, so we currently will do that through automations. We have an automation wizard that pushes data from one application. When something happens, pushes it to the other one, and then when you need to push data from another application to another one, we're just doing all these automations that will push data from all these apps to all they throw it to each other's, and there's very little coordination and sense of it all. So it's a bit of a big mess. Sometimes we don't even know where the data came from, what updated it. I know that's more of a data administration issue than anything else, but yeah, it has to do also with the technology and how we're moving the technology and how from where it's created to where it's needed. So that's what we're considering, that other tools like RudderStack to help us on that. Another consideration is as well that we are very privacy oriented. So for us to keep the data, for example, for us it's a no, for example, just to track the user when they arrive anonymously to our website. We try to keep as little data from there, and the less repositories where that data is stored, the better for us. Okay, so that's what we're not yet at the point where we want to centralize all the data and use a central repository for keeping all that data.
Can I take this one?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, this is like what we do at Big Time Data all day. This is like the situation that everybody finds themselves in, is they've got HubSpot and CRM and Intercom and Marketo and blah, 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 all the tools. And they're trying to figure out, like, how do I make sense of this? And how do I track things across all these various properties? And so, I mean, I guess there's two parts to your question. The privacy piece. At Mattermost, we are also, very privacy conscious, the way that Mattermost wanted to capture their analytics. I would say that obviously, like, if you're trying to not include really any identifying information, then there's at least some things that I would consider not private, like the anonymous ID that RudderStack generates for that user with the, what web pages are they viewing on your marketing site? Like, to me, that I don't know if that would be too above and beyond, but that would be okay to me. identifying really.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it doesn't matter if we only identify the user until they create a trial with us, when they sign the agreements, and then we can track them appropriately across the app.
Oh, okay, I got you.
But yes, yes, that's not a problem. But yeah, we're trying to reduce the amount of data that is stored everywhere, because that's also another repository that we need to take care, and that we need to comply with GDPR laws, and
Sure.
And that how long that data can be there, and data deletion requests. So yeah, that's the concern of minimization of where the data is stored. Yeah.
And that's where I would say, honestly, like having a warehouse first approach actually helps you.
Okay.
Because if you think about it, I'm going to pipe all this data into my warehouse, and that's where this data lives. The one place that I know, like, oh, they converted to a trial, so I have their email in this data warehouse, right? So then it's like, if you have to go back and deal with GDPR, if you update that in your warehouse, and your warehouse is the source of where all this data about that user is getting synced to, Salesforce or Intercom or whatever, then when that GDPR request comes in, you can null all that identifying information out just in that one place. Then your reverse ETL processes will automatically propagate out all that sort of data scrubbing, and then you don't have to deal with it in like, oh, this person came in with the GDPR request, I got to go talk to like 8 different people because he's the admin of Salesforce, she's the admin of Intercom, and blah 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 blah. So I think like I would really really think about the warehouse first approach, because I think this actually could help you. And then it also lets you get your mind around all those interactions that they're having in all those different apps, like you're saying. If you can use sort of that, I mean, you kind of have to coalesce around like an identifier for that user, but once you coalesce around that identifier, then you can say, oh, this is what happened to this user in Salesforce, this is what happened in Intercom, this is what happened in Zendesk. Now you have like all the places that this user has sort of engaged with your company or product. Anyway, sorry, I'm kind of hammering.
Yeah, no, it's great. Just a couple things I'd add there, George, is one, RudderStack doesn't store any data. So we collect it, we process it, and then we route it, but we don't store any of your data. So that's a core principle for us. We don't want to create another data silo for you to deal with. And then as far as connecting all of your apps, the real, like one of the key values that RudderStack brings is you instrument the SDKs for RudderStack, and then collect data one time and then send it to all your downstream applications, right? So that could be website behavior data, it could be form fills that create contacts, in Intercom, HubSpot, customer success, etc. So all of that happens simultaneously just with one tracking event with RudderStack. But then you can also connect your stack in other ways. So you can pull in data from SaaS applications. So let's say you have Zendesk for customer support. You can actually pull in all of your customer support data from Zendesk into your warehouse, and then sort of analyze, are there certain types of customers that create more support tickets, etc. And then reverse ETL our reverse ETL feature is called Warehouse Actions. You can actually take that data and then push it back out to tools. So let's say, you want to flag customers who have created, more than 5 tickets as high-risk customers, and you want to push that to Salesforce or something like that. You can use reverse ETL, and RudderStack is the set of pipelines that connects all of those. So it makes it way, way easier to make sense of all the different tools in your stack that sort of have varying data sets. We help you unify all of that.
Okay, great. Thank
Awesome,
you.
Great question. We had, let's see. Feel free to keep the questions coming in. I know we're getting close to time here. Dan asked, is there a simple way to exclude bot traffic, spiders, etc.? We're currently pulling apart the user agent to find this. Alex, I'd be interested in your answer. We see a lot of customers do this with transformations, where you can take the payload and then block events. As you see this happen, you can kind of update the transformation as you see sort of new unique bot traffic. And then our data governance API soon will support blocking as well. So you can handle that, like on a version controlled repo in GitHub, which will be nice. But would love your thoughts on that, Alex.
Yeah, we've actually just been filtering that with DBT. on the DBT side. So I mean, I guess that's pretty much akin to doing it via RudderStack transformations. I kind of am of the, I always err towards like, give me more data in my warehouse and then I'll deal with it. But I think actually, I mean, the data governance API is something I need to look more into, but that could definitely be something that would be super cool to start playing around with.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great point. If you want all of the raw data, leveraging something like DBT is really helpful because you'll still get the data in the warehouse. But there also are some times where, you know, if the bot traffic is just causing so much noise or sort of causing problems for downstream APIs for SaaS tools or whatever, blocking it in the actual live event stream can help. Cool. Any other questions? I know we're right at time here, but if someone wants to sneak in one more question, we might be able to answer it. I don't see anything coming through. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll send a follow-up email with the information we mentioned, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions.
Yeah, that was fun. Thanks
That was
all.
great. Yep. Always a pleasure, Alex. Thanks.
Yep.